First two games of the World Cup final between Levon Aronian and Liren were drawn. So let's see what happened in the next two classical games, in games 3 and 4. Game 3, Aronian with the white pieces, and he's playing the English or Reti, it's a mixture between the two, and d5 from Ding. Now Aronian could play d4 going into the Catalan, which he likes very much with white, but I think he wanted to avoid Ding's favourite variation with bishop b4 check and then either bishop d6 or bishop e7. This was one of my recommendations in my DVD, A Repertoire for Black against Catalan, and this has been doing pretty well at top levels, well, at all levels actually. Very reliable opening for black and offers very dynamic chances too. So Aronian tried to avoid that system by playing bishop g2, and now if bishop e7, the sneaky idea is you play d4 and you've got a Catalan, but you've avoided this variation with bishop b4 check. But of course Ding is fully aware of what Aronian is doing, and so instead he deviated and played pawn takes pawn, which was also my recommendation on my DVD. So Aronian recaptures the pawn with queen a4 check, and Ding plays exactly my recommendation. You can play knight d7, you can play c6, but Ding went bishop d7 and then played c5, so preventing white, or discouraging white from playing d4, gaining some space. Now the only problem with this is that white can play knight e5. By the way, if black is able to get in bishop c6, put the bishop on the long diagonal opposing the bishop, play knight d7, he has no problems at all. So that's why if white is going to get anything from this variation, he has to try knight e5. So threatens bishop takes pawn. Of course, playing the knight or bishop into c6 would allow the doubled pawns, doubled isolated pawns, and they're too weak. You can't really go in for that with black. So therefore queen c8, guarding this pawn. And here the normal move for white is to play castles kingside. And now we see the point of this variation for black. Knight c6. Now white grabs the bishop, so this is a wonderful piece on g2 with no opponent. However, black actually has solved the problem of that light squared bishop on c8, and the point is that this knight is looking at this wonderful square on d4, and here black has no difficulties whatsoever. So for example, game between Nakamura and Ulyanov from Baku 2015, you can see that black's pieces are very harmoniously placed. White struggles to break free with moves like b4 and d4. Black is absolutely fine here in spite of the fact that white has the two bishops. It's all about that beautiful knight on c6 controlling d4. So this is the idea of the system. And here, instead of the usual castles, Aronian, after precisely 5 seconds thought, played queen d3, which looks like a really bizarre move, but of course when I ran this through my computer, this was Komodo 11's first choice, queen d3. This looks like such a computer move. No human would really come up with this idea of blocking this pawn on d2. So what's the point? Well, after knight c6, which Ding played, then Aronian traded on d7, and the point is that black would like to play queen takes d7, but I think we can say that this ending is certainly a little bit better for white, because here the king perhaps doesn't want to be in the middle. I mean, it needs to shuffle a bit to get to e7, and here I think white does have a little bit of an advantage with this bishop on g2. It's not quite as good as the middle game for black. Therefore, Ding recapture with the knight, and that puts the knight slightly out of position. So this is the idea of this variation. Nevertheless, white is losing a lot of time with the queen. It takes time to shuffle around. So I don't think black's position could be that bad. And indeed, Ding proved that black's position here is fully viable. So these are the moves of the game. Rook d8, okay, on the semi-open file. Knight comes to b6. I think that's reasonable because it starts to block out the queen, and even sometimes you can threaten to get in c4. And you can see that knight is still in an excellent position, ready to come into d4. Certainly after knight b6 it's ready to come into d4 because b7 is covered. So therefore white has to play bishop e3, but in any case Ding played knight d4, and well, white can't live with this knight here. So Aronian exchanged bishop for knight, and just for a moment, it has to be said, black looks a little uncomfortably placed with the rook opposite the queen and the bishop bearing down on b7. So white is just a little bit more active. Nevertheless, Ding found a couple of accurate moves. First of all, rook d7, good move, guarding the pawn on b7. And after a4, he just shuffled across with queen d8. This isn't the only way to go, but I think this is very reliable. So the point is, the rook protects the pawn on b7. The queen shuffles across, away from the rook on the c-file, and prepares to bring the rook into play. Aronian tried a5, but now the knight comes very solidly to d5, blocking out the bishop. And I think basically black has equalised here. Aronian tried this and d4 to somehow break open the position. I think, well, he has to do something, otherwise black just has a nice centre. Now, I think there's just this kind of little positional trick here. If c4, which perhaps we might like to play to sort of get some kind of pawn majority on the queen side, but here this is certainly pleasant for white, because after this pawn break b3, after the pawns are traded, then there'll be two weak pawns, b7 and d5. Of course, Ding realised that, so instead he took on d4 that just kind of, took any danger out of the position. And here it's very hard for white to gain any advantage. Aronian tried, his bishop is a little bit better than black's. Nevertheless, actually there are no real difficulties for black in this position. After queen f5, activating the queen, suddenly there are sort of threats sometimes to play this and d3. Well, f7 is the only weakness in the position, and that's easily defended. So after a few more moves, the players agreed to a draw. So Aronian tried a little something, but Ding, I think, defended very successfully, and that system, I'm very glad to say, is fully viable for black. So into game 4. So still with the classical time control. And Aronian had a very good opening. Ding misplayed it. I think both players showing signs of great tiredness. They've been at this tournament for weeks now, over 3 weeks. It's really tough. And although Aronian won a pawn in the opening, you can see he has an extra pawn here. Ding, with his bishop against the knight, somehow managed to create play. Rooks and bishop often work very well together, and Ding has done that really successfully here. So the bishop is on an excellent square, supported by the pawn. This knight is on a nice outpost, but actually it's not hitting too much. And here Ding played rook g6. So you first glance I thought, what on earth is this rook up to? It seems so this is a blind alley. Rook a3, perhaps looking to play a knight in here or a rook in here to block out white's rook. And now g4. This was Ding's plan, to break up these kingside pawns and actually open things up against the king, because suddenly black has to be quite careful here with things like rook check coming. Not easy. Aronian played rook h3. Again, looks dangerous. Suddenly, weak pawn. But Ding had calculated this very well, and after bishop e4, actually he has enough play to draw the game. Of course, if rook takes pawn, then bishop g6 check wins a lump. And, well, Aronian has to be careful here. Suddenly his king is under a bit of pressure. There's also a chance for white to play rook d6 to attack the pawn on b6. So here Aronian took off that potentially dangerous bishop, but once they reach a rook and pawn endgame, it is, well, it's definitely drawn, because white's rooks are just too active here. Hitting two pawns, I mean, black can take on b5, but you know, once they reach a position like this, of course, 2 against 1 on the king side is just a draw. Aronian played rook e5, but this didn't help matters at all. But he knew that. He was looking really dejected at this point. This pawn on b6 is just too strong. Black just can't get a grip of the position here. Black always has to take care of the pawn, and you know, even if black brings the king over to win the pawn, then the rook will be able to take one of these pawns here. It's just a stone cold draw. So I think, well, first of all, we can say that both players showing signs of tiredness. Ding played the opening inaccurately and found himself in an endgame, a pawn down, having to defend. Aronian, I think, will be disappointed with this game because he was a clear pawn up, and I think, you know, if he'd been a bit fresher on another day, I think he would have won this game, won this endgame. That means that after 4 games, we've had 4 draws. So now we go into the tie breaks. So the players will play 2 25-minute games to decide who will be the champion. And, well, if those are drawn, then they play 2 10-minute games. If those are drawn, 2 blitz games, and then finally an Armageddon game. Let's see what happens in the tie breaks.